A Korean Mafia boss handed his black maid an unlimited credit card and told her she had 24 hours to empty his account. Less than 2 hours later, a transaction notification lit up his phone. It wasn't from Cartier. It wasn't from Hermes. It wasn't a first-class ticket out of Seoul. It was something he never expected. Instantly, he knew this woman was different because in that moment, she made a choice that would crack open his armored heart and force him to confront a truth he'd spent his entire life running from. 34-year-old Bernard Choi had stopped believing people were anything but buyers and sellers years ago. Before continuing, comment where in the world you're watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. As the ruthless head of the Biko Syndicate, a criminal empire that controlled everything from Seoul's Gangnam district to the port cities of Busan, he'd watched humans trade their souls for protection, power, and proximity to wealth. His penthouse overlooking the Han River had floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected a city he owned but never belonged to, walls decorated with stolen art and the silence of a man who commanded fear but never love. He had safe houses in 4 countries. The watch on his tattooed wrist cost more than his maid earned in 3 years. Yet every night he fell asleep feeling like a king ruling over a graveyard. His late mentor, Tiger Kim Tae-sung, had carved one law into him during his blood initiation: everyone betrays. Everyone has a price. The virtuous are just liars who haven't been offered enough yet. Trust nothing but fear, loyalty bought with violence, and power maintained through ruthlessness. The poor especially, they'll smile while cleaning your floors and slit your throat for a fraction of what's in your wallet. Bernard had lived by that code like it was oxygen for 34 years. Every act of generosity in his organization was leverage. Every favor granted came with invisible chains. Every sign of weakness was a death sentence in a world where rivals circled like sharks in dark water. He'd never once looked someone in the eye and simply trusted them. Not without insurance, not without surveillance, not without an exit strategy carved in blood. Until Caroline Williams walked into his home with nothing but a reference letter and eyes that refused to be afraid of him. Bernard Choi killed his first man at 19 with a broken soju bottle and never looked back. By 25, he'd earned the tattoo that marked him as Biko's enforcer, a black dragon coiling up his right arm, its mouth open in eternal rage across his shoulder blade. By 30, he was the dragon itself, sitting at the head of a table where men twice his age bowed and called him Hyeongnam with voices that shook. His penthouse was a temple to controlled violence. The living room where he held court was all black marble and floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of space that made visitors feel exposed, vulnerable, like prey in an open field. He liked it that way. The art on his walls wasn't bought at galleries, it was taken from collectors who'd borrowed money they couldn't repay. The Ming vase in the corner had been a Yakuza boss's apology after a territorial dispute ended with 3 bodies in the Busan harbor. Everything in Bernard's world was a trophy or a warning. He ran the Biko Syndicate the way his mentor had taught him, with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove, ruthless but never reckless, brutal but calculated. Protection rackets in Itaewon. Import-export operations that laundered millions through legitimate shipping companies. Nightclubs where the real business happened in VIP rooms behind soundproof doors. He controlled judges, cops, politicians, anyone whose loyalty could be bought or whose family could be threatened. And he trusted absolutely no one. Which is why Caroline Williams confused him from the moment the agency sent her. She'd arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 years ago with a reference letter and a quiet dignity that made no sense. Most people who entered his home couldn't hide their fear, eyes darting to the exit, hands trembling when they poured his coffee, voices pitched too high with forced cheerfulness. They'd seen the tattoos, heard the rumors, felt the weight of who he was. Caroline had looked him in the eye, nodded once, and asked where he kept the cleaning supplies. No flinching when his lieutenants arrived for meetings, their voices raised in anger over territory disputes. No gasping when she walked past his office and saw him counting stacks of cash that would take her 5 years to earn. No crying when she accidentally witnessed him break a man's fingers for skimming profits. She'd simply closed the door quietly and continued vacuuming the hallway. Bernard had waited for her angle. Everyone had one. Was she a plant from a rival syndicate? An undercover investigator building a case? A woman who'd eventually demand money to keep quiet about what she'd seen. But months passed, then a year, then two, and Caroline remained exactly what she appeared to be, a single mother from Nigeria who cleaned his home with the same meticulous care whether he was watching or not, who hummed gospel songs under her breath while she worked, who left his space more peaceful than she'd found it. He'd tested her in small ways. Left cash on the counter. It was always there when he returned. Asked invasive questions about her life. She answered with polite boundaries but no defensiveness. Brought dangerous men into his home for late-night meetings. She brought them tea without judgment and disappeared. The dragon had circled this quiet woman for 3 years, waiting for her to reveal her fangs. Instead, she kept being kind. Kept being honest. Kept treating him like he was human instead of monster. And that terrified him more than any rival ever had. The idea came to Bernard on a Friday night after his 4th whiskey, watching Caroline wipe down his kitchen counters with the same careful attention she gave everything. He'd just returned from a meeting where one of his own men had tried to skim off a shipment, 20 kilograms of product disappearing into side deals and lies. Bernard had made an example of him in a warehouse by the docks. Blood under his fingernails, rage in his chest, and that familiar emptiness that followed violence like a shadow. Everyone could be bought. Everyone had a breaking point. His mentor had been right about that. But what was Caroline's price? The question had haunted him for 3 years like a ghost he couldn't exorcise. He pulled his black credit card from his wallet, the one with no limit, the one connected to accounts that held money from 1,000 sins. He placed it on the marble kitchen island between them. Caroline. She turned, dish towel in her hands, that same unreadable calm in her dark eyes. Take this. You have 24 hours to spend whatever you want. Empty the account if you can. Buy anything. Go anywhere. No questions asked. He pushed the card toward her. I want to see what you'll do. He expected shock. Maybe excitement. Perhaps that flash of greed he'd seen in every other person who'd ever stood this close to real money. The mask slipping, revealing the hunger underneath. Instead, Caroline looked at the card like it was a live grenade. She dried her hands slowly, methodically, folding the towel with the same precision she brought to everything. Then she stepped forward and picked up the card, holding it between 2 fingers as if testing its weight. Her expression wasn't joy or triumph or even surprise. It was something Bernard couldn't name. Something heavy and ancient and sad. Why? She asked quietly. Does it matter? He leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, studying her face like he'd study an opponent across a negotiation table. Most people would have already left. You're still asking questions. Most people aren't holding someone else's soul in their hands. She met his eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, he saw something that looked like pity. Not for herself. For him. The words hit him like a punch to the solar plexus. 24 hours, he repeated, voice harder now, defensive. Starting now. Prove me right or prove me wrong. I don't care which. That was a lie. He cared desperately. His entire worldview balanced on the edge of what this woman would do with unlimited access to his wealth. Caroline slipped the card into the pocket of her uniform. I'll bring it back tomorrow night. If you come back, he said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. She looked at him with those eyes that had never once shown fear, never once shown judgment, and said something that would echo in his mind for the next 24 hours. Mr. Choi, I've been coming back every day for 3 years. Why would I stop now? Then she finished wiping down the counters, gathered her coat, and walked out of his penthouse into the Seoul night carrying a weapon more powerful than any gun in his safe. Bernard poured another whiskey and waited for the notifications to start. The dragon had just handed the lamb his throat. Bernard sat in his darkened office, the glow of his phone the only light in the room. The city sprawled below him through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seoul at night, a galaxy of neon and ambition, every light representing someone buying, selling, taking, keeping. His city. His empire built on the simple truth that everyone eventually revealed their true nature when money was involved. The whiskey glass sweated condensation onto the mahogany desk. He'd poured it an hour ago and hadn't touched it. His eyes stayed fixed on the phone screen, waiting for the inevitable cascade of notifications that would prove his mentor right one final time. She'd been gone 90 minutes. He'd already imagined the purchases. First-class ticket to Lagos, that's what he'd do if he were escaping. Or maybe London, somewhere with extradition complications. A smart woman would buy gift cards, harder to trace. Jewelry that could be resold. A suite at the Shilla Hotel while she planned her next move. He'd seen enough runners to know the playbook. His thumb hovered over the banking app, refreshing it every few minutes like a man checking for test results he already knew would destroy him. The dragon tattoo on his arm seemed to pulse in the dim light. 17 years he'd worn that mark. 17 years of building an empire on the principle that trust was for the weak and loyalty was a transaction. Caroline would be no different. She couldn't be. Because if she was, then everything he'd done, every line he'd crossed, every piece of his humanity he'd carved away, it had all been a choice, not a necessity. His phone lit up. Bernard's heart slammed against his ribs. He grabbed the device, nearly dropping it, pulled up the notification with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy. Transaction alert, 440,000 Korean wons, $330. Merchant, Haebangkon Community Clinic. 11:47 p.m. He stared at the screen. Read it again. Then a third time. A clinic? Not Gucci. Not Louis Vuitton. Not Korean Air First Class. A clinic in Haebangkon, the old neighborhood where immigrants and working-class families lived stacked on top of each other in buildings that hadn't been renovated since the 70s. Bernard's mind raced through possibilities. Maybe she was sick. Maybe she needed medical care and this was just the first stop before the real spending began. That had to be it. Practical necessities before the luxury items. He pulled up the transaction details, hands moving with the muscle memory of a man who tracked money his entire life. The payment description loaded. Payment for outstanding patient medical debts, multiple accounts. Not treatment for herself. Payment for other people's debts. Bernard sat back in his chair, the leather creaking in the silence. The city lights blurred slightly. He realized his hands were shaking. This was a trick. Had to be. Some kind of long con he hadn't anticipated. Maybe she was paying off debts for accomplices, people who'd help her later. Street-level thinking. Smart, actually. Build goodwill, create a network, then disappear with the real money. His phone stayed silent for another 20 minutes. Then it pinged again. Transaction alert, 890,000 Korean wons, $670. Merchant, Soul Dreams Orphanage. 12:09 a.m. Bernard stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. He stared at the phone like it had betrayed him. An orphanage. The dragon had given the lamb his throat, and instead of running, she was washing his blood-stained money clean. Bernard was out the door before he'd made a conscious decision to move. He took the private elevator down to the garage, grabbed the keys to the black sedan, not the Mercedes with the tinted windows that screamed syndicate boss, but the older Hyundai he kept for surveillance work. The car that made him invisible. His phone pinged twice more before he'd even left the parking garage. Transaction alert, 1,200,000 Korean wons, Hanbit Church Building Fund. Transaction alert, 650,000 Korean wons, Day 1 Middle School Lunch Program. He drove through Seoul's late-night streets with the focus of a hunter tracking prey, except he didn't know if he was chasing a saint or a con artist brilliant enough to play the longest game he'd ever seen. The banking app showed her location through the card's GPS. She was in Gyeongdong now, one of the districts where factory workers and day laborers lived in half-basement apartments that flooded when it rained. Bernard knew these streets. He'd collected protection money here for years, watched his men shake down small business owners who could barely afford to eat. These were the people his empire was built on, the ones too desperate to fight back, too afraid to say no. He found her outside a 24-hour pharmacy, and what he saw made him kill the engine half a block away. Caroline stood under the flickering fluorescent light talking to an elderly woman in a wheelchair, her daughter beside her looking exhausted in a convenience store uniform. Caroline was holding the black card, but she wasn't waving it like a lottery ticket. She was listening. Actually listening, head tilted, hand on the old woman's shoulder like she had all the time in the world. Then she went inside. Bernard watched through the pharmacy window as Caroline spoke to the night clerk, pointing to items on the shelves. Insulin. Blood pressure medication. Pain relievers. The kind of medicine that kept poor people alive but destroyed them financially. The clerk's eyes went wide. Caroline nodded, smiled, and handed over the card. Transaction alert, 840,000 Korean wons, Seoul Pharmacy. When Caroline emerged, the daughter was crying, hugging her like she'd just been visited by an angel. The old woman reached up and took Caroline's hand, pressing it to her forehead in a gesture of gratitude that made Bernard's chest tighten. He followed her for 3 more hours through the underbelly of his empire. She stopped at a pojangmaka where day laborers ate cheap stew after 14-hour shifts. She bought out the entire cart's inventory and told the owner to feed everyone who came by until dawn. The workers stared at her like she'd descended from heaven in a housemaid's uniform. She walked into a PC bang where teenagers from broken homes spent nights because going back to their apartments meant facing violence or neglect. She paid the owner for 3 months of computer time for every kid in there. They looked at her with confusion, then wonder, then something like hope Bernard had forgotten existed. In Sindangdong, she found a woman selling fruit from a cart, maybe 70 years old, hands twisted with arthritis. Caroline bought her entire stock then gave it away to everyone walking past. The old woman wept. Bernard sat in his car watching this woman move through the districts he'd exploited for 17 years, and everywhere she went, she left light. Not as a victim navigating dangerous streets. As a queen distributing mercy to subjects his empire had forgotten were human. His phone wouldn't stop pinging. And Bernard Choi, the dragon of Biko, sat alone in the dark realizing he'd spent his entire life conquering a kingdom he'd never actually seen. It happened in an alley off Cheonggyecheon, the kind of narrow space where streetlights didn't reach and the city's underbelly showed its teeth. Bernard had been following Caroline for 6 hours now, watching her empty his accounts one act of mercy at a time. His phone had stopped shocking him, the notifications had become a rhythm, a heartbeat of generosity that made his own pulse feel arrhythmic and wrong. She'd just left a late-night soup kitchen, having paid off their food supplier debts for the next 6 months, when 3 young men materialized from the shadows. Early 20s, knockoff designer jackets, hair bleached and styled to imitate K-pop stars. Street-level predators. Bernard recognized the type, wannabe gangsters who worked the edges of territories his organization controlled, too small to be threats, too stupid to know when they were outmatched. They'd been watching her. Of course they had. A black woman alone at 3 in the morning, pulling out a credit card that looked like it belonged in a billionaire's wallet. Easy prey. Bernard's hand moved to the door handle. He could cross the distance in seconds, break the first one's arm before the others even registered the threat. He'd done it 1,000 times. His body was already moving, muscle memory taking over. But something made him stop. Caroline had turned to face them, and she wasn't afraid. "That's a nice card, a Jumma," the leader said in English rough around the edges. He stepped closer, gold chain catching the distant streetlight. "Maybe you let us borrow it, yeah? We give back tomorrow." His friends laughed. Everyone knew tomorrow never came in conversations like this. "No," Caroline said simply. Not backing away. Not reaching for her phone. Just standing there with a presence that seemed to fill the entire alley. The leader's smile faltered. "You don't understand. We're not asking. And I'm not giving." Caroline's voice was quiet but it carried weight, the kind of authority that didn't come from violence but from something older, deeper. "This money isn't mine to protect. It belongs to people who need it more than you do." "We need it," the second one said, moving to flank her. "You think you're better than us? Bernard's fingers tightened on the door handle. One of them had his hand in his jacket pocket now, probably gripping a knife. This was the moment. He should move. He would move. "I think you're scared," Caroline said, and the words stopped everyone cold. "I think you're angry at a world that gave you nothing and promised you everything. I think you look at people like me and see someone even lower than you, and that makes you feel powerful for 5 minutes." She took a step forward, and incredibly, they stepped back. "But taking this card won't fix what's broken. It'll just make you smaller than you already feel." The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. "I can help you," Caroline continued, softer now. "Not with this card. But I know places. Shelters. Programs. People who'll see you as more than what you've done." The leader stared at her, something crumbling behind his eyes. His hand came out of his pocket, empty. "You're crazy," he muttered, but the venom was gone. They melted back into the shadows like smoke, leaving Caroline standing alone in the alley, still holding Bernard's black card like a sword that had never needed to be drawn. Bernard sat frozen in his car, hands still on the door handle, realizing he'd just watched someone disarm danger with nothing but truth. His phone pinged again. She was moving. Dawn was breaking over Seoul when Bernard's phone showed the final transaction, and the location made him grip the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. Transaction alert, 18,500,000 Korean wons, $13,900 US. Merchant, Hanero Mart, Guro District. 5:47 a.m. 18 million won at a grocery store. The number was massive, impossible for normal shopping. Bernard's exhausted mind couldn't process what she could possibly be buying. His accounts had been hemorrhaging money for 9 hours straight, over 200 transactions across the poorest districts of Seoul. Hospitals. Schools. Shelters. Churches. Individual families whose names he'd never know. The dragon's hoard being distributed piece by piece to the very people his empire had spent years bleeding dry. He drove to the Hanero Mart as the city woke up around him, his eyes burning from lack of sleep, his chest tight with something that felt like drowning. The parking lot was nearly empty. Through the store's wide windows, he could see mountains of supplies stacked in shopping carts, rice bags, cooking oil, dried goods, produce, everything. Bernard walked through the automatic doors into harsh fluorescent lighting and found her. Caroline stood in the center of the store surrounded by what looked like the entire inventory of the dried goods section. Carts and carts of supplies. But that wasn't what stopped him cold. She was crying, her shoulders shaking, while an elderly Korean woman in worn clothes held both her hands, speaking rapidly in Korean through her own tears. A young mother with a baby strapped to her chest stood nearby, weeping. A man in a street cleaner's uniform had his hand over his mouth, eyes red. The store manager hovered at the edge of the scene, looking overwhelmed and awed in equal measure. Bernard moved closer, and Caroline looked up. Their eyes met across the distance, and he saw something in her face that broke him, not triumph, not pride, but grief. Deep, bottomless grief. "Mr. Choi," she said, and her voice cracked. She wiped her eyes but the tears kept coming. "I bought everything. Everything in the store that could feed people. The manager is going to distribute it to the neighborhood. 3 months of food for families who work 3 jobs and still go to bed hungry." The elderly woman said something in Korean. Bernard understood every word. "She is an angel." "An angel." "I'm not," Caroline said in halting Korean, then switched back to English. "I'm not an angel. This isn't my money. This is blood money." She looked at Bernard, and her eyes held the weight of everything she'd seen in his home for 3 years. This money came from pain. From fear. From people who had no choice but to pay or suffer. "I know what you are, Mr. Choi. I've always known." Bernard felt like he'd been shot. The store tilted around him. "So I spent the night trying to wash it clean." Caroline's voice broke. "Everyone that came from darkness, I tried to turn into light. Every person you took from, I tried to give back to. Not because I could fix it, but because someone had to try. She pulled his black card from her pocket and held it out. It's empty now. I spent everything I could reach in 24 hours. Your accounts will recover. They always do. She stepped closer, and her next words were a whisper that echoed like thunder. But will you? Bernard took the card with hands that trembled, and for the first time in 17 years, the dragon wept. They drove back to the penthouse in silence as Seoul rushed into its morning chaos around them. Bernard had insisted on driving her home, as if his sterile tower could be called that for anyone. Caroline sat in the passenger seat of the Hyundai, exhausted, her uniform wrinkled from a night of mercy that had probably saved more lives than Bernard had taken in his entire career. That thought sat in his chest like a knife. He'd stopped crying in the grocery store parking lot, pulled himself together with the same iron discipline that had kept him alive in a world where weakness meant death. But his hand still shook slightly on the steering wheel, and his reflection in the rearview mirror showed a stranger, eyes red-rimmed, face hollowed out, the dragon tattoo on his neck seeming to coil tighter. They rode the private elevator up in silence. The doors opened onto his penthouse, and the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows felt obscene, too bright, illuminating a space that suddenly looked like a mausoleum of wasted years. Bernard poured himself whiskey even though it was 6 in the morning. His 4th? 5th? He'd lost count. Caroline stood by the kitchen island where this had started 24 hours ago, the black card now sitting between them like evidence at a crime scene. Why? The word came out raw, stripped of the control he usually wrapped around everything. Why did you do it? You could have taken everything and disappeared. New life. New country. Freedom from all of this. He gestured at the penthouse, at himself, at the empire of violence implicit in every expensive surface. Why did you come back? Caroline looked at him with those eyes that had never shown fear, and now he understood why. You couldn't fear something you pitted. Because money is just paper, Mr. Choi. She said it gently, like she was explaining something to a child. It burns. It tears. It gets lost. It changes hands and means nothing by itself. She moved closer, and Bernard found himself rooted to the spot. But the will to do good, that's the only thing that lasts. That's the only thing that survives us. I've built an empire, he said, and his voice cracked. 17 years. Power. Control. Everything I touch turns to gold. Everything you touch turns to loneliness, Caroline corrected quietly. You own this entire city and you have no one. You have millions in the bank and you can't buy a single night of peace. She picked up the black card, held it up to the light. This card gave me access to your accounts for 24 hours. But your heart? You've been locked out of that for 17 years. Bernard slammed the whiskey glass down, and it shattered. Blood welled from his palm where a shard had cut deep. He stared at it, remembering all the blood he'd spilled that had never made him feel anything. Caroline was already moving, grabbing a kitchen towel, reaching for his hand. He pulled back instinctively. Let me help you, she said. 3 words. Simple. Devastating. Bernard let her take his hand. Let her wrap the towel around the cut. Let her tend to a wound that was nothing compared to the ones she'd just exposed. I don't know how to be what you think I could be, he whispered. Then learn, Caroline said. You've got all the time and money in the world. Use them for something that matters. The dragon sat in his palace of glass and chrome, and for the first time, wanted to be something else. The reckoning came 3 days later in the form of Min-suk Park, Bernard's second in command, walking into the penthouse with 4 armed men and an expression that promised violence. Bernard had been expecting this. Word traveled fast in the underworld, 18 million won spent on groceries for the poor, hundreds of thousands to clinics and orphanages, the boss of Biko's syndicate following his maid around Seoul like a lost puppy. Weakness. That's what they'd call it. And weakness in their world was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. We need to talk, Min-suk said, not bothering with honorifics. The 4 men spread out, blocking exits. Professional. Efficient. Bernard had trained them himself. Caroline was in the kitchen. Bernard heard the water shut off, knew she was listening. "Talk," Bernard said. He remained seated on the leather couch, posture relaxed, but his hand rested near the Glock he kept in the side table drawer. Old habits. The council met. They're concerned. Min-suk lit a cigarette without asking permission, another calculated disrespect. Our Hyungnim has been acting strange. Spending millions on charity cases. Being followed by his maid. Crying in grocery stores. He exhaled smoke. It looks weak, Hyungnim. And when you look weak, we all bleed. My money. My choice. Your money came from our work. Our blood. Our risks. Min-suk's voice hardened. And now you're giving it away to people who wouldn't spit on us if we were on fire. The council wants assurance this phase is over. Bernard heard Caroline's footsteps. She appeared in the doorway, and every gun in the room tracked to her. She froze. Leave her out of this, Bernard said, standing now. The dragon tattoo on his arm seemed to writhe in the morning light. She's the problem, Min-suk said flatly. Whatever she did, whatever spell she cast, it ends today. We'll make it clean. She disappears. You grieve for a respectful period. Then we get back to business. He looked at Caroline with the cold assessment of a butcher sizing up meat. Nothing personal, Ajumma. The words hung in the air like a blade. Bernard moved before his conscious mind caught up. He stepped between Min-suk and Caroline, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 17 years ruling through fear. You'll have to go through me. Min-suk's eyes widened. The 4 gunmen shifted, uncertain. This wasn't the script. Hyungnim, don't be stupid. I'm done being smart. Bernard's voice was steady now, certain. I've been smart for 17 years. Built this empire on smart decisions. Hurt smart people. Made smart money. And every smart choice left me emptier than the last. He looked at Caroline, then back at his second-in-command. She showed me something in 24 hours that you couldn't show me in 2 decades. That I'm not just the dragon. I'm also the man the dragon ate. You've lost your mind, Min-suk said, hand moving toward his jacket. Bernard was faster. The Glock cleared the drawer and leveled at Min-suk's chest in one fluid motion. The 4 gunmen raised their weapons, but Bernard had the angle, had the reputation, had 17 years of respect in the chamber. I'm changing the empire, Bernard said quietly. Starting now. We protect instead of prey. We build instead of bleed. Anyone who doesn't like it can walk away clean or stay and adapt. His eyes locked with Min-suk's. But if you touch her, I'll burn this entire organization to the ground and dance in the ashes. 6 months later, the building on the corner of Haebangkon looked nothing like it had when Bernard first bought it. What had been a crumbling warehouse, one of many properties his organization used for storage and intimidation, now had fresh paint the color of sunrise, windows that actually let light in, and a sign in Korean, English, and 4 other languages, Choi Hope Community Center. Bernard stood across the street watching Caroline unlock the doors as the neighborhood woke up around her. She wore jeans and a sweater now instead of the maid's uniform, her hair wrapped in bright fabric, moving with the confidence of a woman who'd finally found her purpose. Behind her, volunteers arrived, former gang members Bernard had offered second chances, grandmothers from the neighborhood, college students doing outreach work, even 2 of his former enforcers who'd decided protecting people felt better than terrorizing them. The center offered everything Caroline had spent that night paying for: free medical clinics twice a week, job training programs, a food bank that never ran empty, after-school care for kids whose parents worked multiple jobs, Korean language classes for immigrants, and a community kitchen that served hot meals every evening. All funded by the Choi Foundation, which Bernard had established with money that used to buy silence and now bought hope. Min-suk had walked away that day in the penthouse, taken 12 men with him, and started working for the Seo family syndicate in Busan. There'd been a territorial dispute, bloody and brief. Bernard had won because he'd learned something his former second-in-command never understood. People who protect something fight harder than people who just destroy. The Biko syndicate still existed, but it looked different now. Bernard had dismantled the protection rackets, shuttered the loan sharking operations, and redirected the import-export business toward legitimate channels. He still had power. You didn't erase 17 years of building an empire overnight. But now that power meant he could walk through Girodong without people crossing the street in fear. It meant shop owners nodded respectfully instead of trembling when he passed. It meant the old woman Caroline had met at the pharmacy stopped him last week to give him homemade kimchi and called him good son. He'd cried about that too. He'd been crying a lot lately. The dragon tattoo on his arm was still there. You couldn't erase the past, but he'd added to it. New ink wove around the old, turning the solitary dragon into something else. A phoenix rising behind it, flames that looked like they could either destroy or purify depending on how you looked at them. His artist had asked what it meant. Bernard told him it meant he was still dangerous, but he'd learned to aim better. Caroline saw him across the street and waved. Even from this distance, he could see her smile, the kind that didn't carry pity anymore but something that looked almost like pride. Bernard crossed the street, dodging morning traffic, and climbed the steps to the community center. Inside, he could hear children laughing, someone teaching a cooking class, the hum of people helping each other survive in a city that chewed up the vulnerable and spit them out. "You're early," Caroline said. "The board meeting isn't until 10. "I know. I wanted to see it." Bernard looked around at the space that used to store stolen goods and now stored hope. "Do you ever regret it? Coming back that night?" Caroline considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "Every single day," she said, and his heart dropped. Then she smiled. "Because it means I have to keep believing you'll finish what we started. And believing in people is exhausting work." "I won't let you down," Bernard said. "I know," Caroline replied. The dragon learned to fly a different way. Through the windows, Seoul stretched out in morning light, still brutal, still beautiful, still his city. But now when Bernard looked at it, he didn't see territory to control. He saw people to protect. And that made all the difference. The empire had changed. So had the emperor. And if this story reminded you that true wealth isn't measured in what you own but in what you're willing to give away, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. More stories of unlikely redemption, dangerous transformations, and the moment cold hearts learn to beat again, coming soon.